Imagine this: a billionaire who didn't even know you existed until yesterday suddenly names you the heir to his entire fortune. But what price will you have to pay for this? You'll only find out by listening to the story. The story begins with a poor boy named Rick, who used to take care of his ailing mother. One day, while Rick was cooking for his mother, she suddenly pulled out a gun in the middle of reading the Bible. Rick knew something was off, but couldn't save his mother from what happened next. Even 3 years after that incident, Rick was still trying to piece his life back together. This morning, when he arrived at his workplace, he found out that his job had been given to someone else. He was fired without any specific reason, so he went to his friend Jeremy, asking for a job. Jeremy, through some hustle and connections, managed to get him work at a huge mansion. While working there, Rick got slightly injured, so he asked the manager, Antoinette, for a first aid kit. At first, rather than helping him, she started scolding him. But when Rick told her he would bandage himself and get back to work, Antoinette decided to lead him inside the mansion for some proper medical attention. Just as Rick was bandaging his wound, another maid came and whispered something into Antoinette's ear. As soon as she heard it, she told Rick to go back outside immediately. On his way out, Rick noticed some money lying on a table. Reminded of his desperate circumstances, he decided to pick up a couple of bills. But just as he was about to leave the room, he looked over and noticed the mansion's owner, George, sitting nearby watching him steal. In the next second, Antoinette arrived as well, and she fired Rick from his job on the spot. Hearing this, Rick was terrified and began to plead with George for forgiveness, citing his poverty as the reason for his wrongdoing. But the real surprise came when George, instead of staying angry, not only forgave him, but also handed Rick the entire stack of money as an advance payment. That same night, Rick moved in with his friend Jeremy. There, Jeremy jokingly asked him what he would do if he somehow got a large amount of money. Rick said that he would travel to many beautiful places, but first and foremost, he would get back together with his ex, Tanya. Hearing that, Jeremy laughed at him and teased him. The next morning, Rick and Jeremy were dividing their tasks when suddenly someone called Rick from inside the mansion. When Rick went in to meet Mr. George, George revealed that he actually had no heir, something he deeply regretted. Then he asked Rick if he believed in God. When Rick nodded, George made him a proposition. If Rick agreed to eat a meal on top of George's dead body once he passed away, then Rick would become the owner of everything George possessed. Rick thought George was joking, but George wasn't in a joking mood at all. He said this was an opportunity that could change Rick's life completely. Rick wasn't ready to do it, but George told him to think it over again. Somewhere deep down, George sensed that Rick's financial hardship would eventually compel him to go through with it. Rick felt weird about the idea of eating on a corpse, so he tried looking for another job, but nothing worked out. Suddenly, someone knocked on his door. There was a man outside, inviting him once more to come to the mansion. A short while later, when Rick arrived, Antoinette broke the news that Mr. George had died, and then she placed a contract in front of him. According to this contract, if Rick ate a meal placed on George's corpse, he would inherit George's entire estate. However, he had to finish every bit of the food, and he would be forbidden from telling anyone about it, even if he wanted to. Initially, Rick couldn't comprehend any of this, but after thinking it over for a bit, he agreed, because he was exhausted from living in poverty. Now, the food was placed on George's corpse, and Rick, summoning whatever courage he had, began to eat. Meanwhile, Antoinette kept reminding him that he absolutely had to finish the entire meal. If anything remained, he wouldn't get the inheritance. As soon as Rick succeeded in finishing, Antoinette handed him a card with George's final words written on it. A kind of contract that stated Rick would now take on all of George's troubles, while giving George his own untainted soul in exchange. At that moment, Rick wasn't in the right state of mind to think things through, and he signed the contract without fully reading it. Immediately afterward, he began to feel extremely strange, and as soon as he lay down in his bed at home, it was as if he was suddenly underwater. Spirits surrounded him from all sides, and he was terrified. The next morning, while wandering around the mansion, Rick noticed a man staring at him, but in the blink of an eye, that man vanished. Rick tried to run after him, but Antoinette stopped him, acting as if nothing had happened. She also told Rick that he was now the owner of the mansion and could have all the work done as he wished. For now, though, Rick had no idea what to do with this brand new life of his. Right then, Antoinette handed him an unlimited credit card, telling him to go out and enjoy his new life. A while later, Rick went to Jeremy's place to pick up his stuff. He tried giving Jeremy some money, but Jeremy outright refused to accept it. There, Rick once again bumped into his ex, Tanya, who asked him if he'd won the lottery or something. Rick answered, "I've gotten something way better than a lottery." He wanted to take Tanya out somewhere, but she refused because she still didn't fully trust him. After that, Rick went to a club where he ordered the most expensive liquor for himself. Seeing his extravagant style, a man confronted him, questioning whether Rick could really afford such an expensive drink. Angered by this remark, Rick bought 2 bottles, one for himself and one for the man who had taunted him. Then, after drinking, he returned to the mansion, where he saw a woman. When he touched his nose, he realized there was blood on his face. But when he turned back toward the woman, she was gone. A moment later, that same woman suddenly appeared again, accusing Rick and attacking him. At that point, Rick felt once more as if he were sinking underwater. When he regained consciousness, he was lying on the floor. Seeing himself in that state, Rick immediately went to Antoinette and accused her of having drugged him, causing him to see ghosts. Hearing this, Antoinette realized it was time for Rick to learn the truth. First, though, she told him to calm down, but Rick demanded answers, so he asked Antoinette to show him George's last words again. As soon as he read them once more, everything started to make sense. He realized what he had done, but he still couldn't believe it was all truly happening. Antoinette then explained to him that sometime before his death, Mr. George had gotten involved in strange black magic so that he could transfer his share of evil deeds onto someone else, thus saving himself from going to hell after death. Antoinette showed Rick a book describing a special ritual in which people chose someone to sit over their corpse and eat a meal, allowing all their sins to be transferred through the act of eating. Such individuals are called sin eaters. Rick now understood that he had become exactly that, a sin eater. Antoinette told him that money always comes with a price, but Rick wanted to fix everything. Without wasting any time, he went straight to a church to seek redemption. However, when the priest asked him, "Tell me, what sins have you committed?" Rick had no idea how to respond because these sins weren't really his. They all belonged to Mr. George. Unable to explain anything, he silently returned from the church. Back at the mansion, Rick tried asking every single servant about Mr. George's past, but no one would reveal anything. So in desperation, he threatened to fire Antoinette unless she told him about George's sins. Finally, Antoinette produced Mr. George's police records, an audio tape, and all of his confessions. Upon examining them, Rick discovered that George had been accused of murdering his wife, Susan, an accusation George had never admitted to. But as soon as Rick read through the file, it became obvious to him that the woman who had attacked him earlier was indeed Susan's spirit. With this information, Rick went back to the church and revealed his sin to the priest. The priest prayed to Jesus to free Rick from this burden. During the prayer, Susan once again tried to strangle Rick, but thanks to the priest's timely prayers, Susan's spirit was driven away just in time. A while later, Rick got a call from Tanya, who told him about Jeremy's strange behavior and asked him to speak to Jeremy. That same night, while Rick was watching TV, he sensed that someone was standing by his sofa. The moment he turned to look, a lamp suddenly fell to the floor. When Rick went to pick up the lamp, a man in a mask began chasing him. Frightened, Rick yelled for Antoinette and ran toward the stairs. There, he encountered a small child, covered in blood. Just then, Antoinette arrived, and seeing Rick so shaken up, tried to calm him down. Then she explained that Mr. George had also been from a very poor family, and that he too had changed his destiny by becoming a sin eater. In other words, George had acquired countless sins, and now that George was gone, all of these sins had passed on to Rick. Antoinette believed it was never going to end, because the same thing had happened to George, and driven by these terrifying apparitions, he had ultimately taken his own life. Rick, wanting to free himself from everything, asked Antoinette what the way out could possibly be. Antoinette told him there was only one way out. He had to pass his burden to someone else who was willing to take it. Otherwise, he would have to endure these things until the day he died. She also advised him to enjoy all the money he had while he could, because there was no telling how much longer he might live. Poor Rick was now paralyzed by indecision. He tried once again to see the priest, but the priest refused even to let him enter the church. That night, Rick found it impossible to sleep, so he started taking pills Antoinette had given him. Yet the moment he lay down, he began seeing spirits all around him again, so terrifying that he fell off the bed. At that exact moment, Antoinette appeared, but Rick was only half conscious. He thought he saw his mother, and as he reached out for her, she turned into Tanya. The two of them apologized to each other. The next instant, all the spirits attacked him, but his mother's spirit protected him. Then Rick snapped back to reality, with doctors somehow managing to stabilize him. Afterward, Rick told Antoinette that he now wanted to do something different, no matter how dangerous the path might be. Antoinette reminded him that the ritual was so bizarre that even Mr. George hadn't agreed to go through with it a second time. She asked him once more, "Are you sure you want to give up all your money?" Rick replied, "I'd rather be a beggar than live like this." But when Antoinette asked if there was anyone who would willingly shoulder this burden, Rick had no answer. He then turned the question back on Antoinette, asking if she would take on such a responsibility. Antoinette flatly refused, saying that whoever knew about the deal she had struck would never volunteer to do it. She also hinted, "What about your friend Jeremy? Maybe he'll do it." But Rick wasn't willing to put his closest friend through this misery. Just then, Rick got a call from Jeremy, who said he was in huge trouble and needed some money from Rick. As soon as Rick heard this, he grabbed some cash and his gun and rushed over to Jeremy's place. But upon arriving, he saw what appeared to be a spirit begging him for help. Rick fired a shot at it, but it turned out to be Tanya, not a spirit. She collapsed in front of him, already dead. Within seconds, Rick's driver whisked him away from there, and Antoinette reassured him that she would handle everything, telling him not to worry. At this point, Rick was so distressed that he wanted to end everything. Antoinette reminded him of what he needed to do for that to happen. Now Rick simply wanted to wash his hands of it all, even if it meant passing the curse on to Jeremy. A little while later, Jeremy showed up, devastated by Tanya's death, but in urgent need of work to pay his bills. Antoinette then told Jeremy that Rick wanted him to become a sin eater, and Jeremy immediately agreed, assuming it was some kind of joke. Soon after, Rick lay down on a table, where doctors were preparing to carry out the ritual. Antoinette assured him that this method would definitely work. After some time, the doctor gave Rick an injection that stopped his heartbeat. In that other realm, Rick regained consciousness, surrounded by spirits crying out for help. Among them, he saw his mother, but as soon as he approached her, she turned into Tanya. They both apologized to each other. The next second, all the spirits attacked him, but this time, his mother's spirit saved him. At that moment, Rick came to again, and Antoinette told him that Jeremy had completed the ritual and taken all of Rick's troubles onto himself. Rick was now completely free. 6 months later, Rick was back to working as a construction laborer. In the final scene, Rick was sitting in a park, but he wasn't alone. Tanya's spirit was there with him. Rick had chosen not to force his sins onto Jeremy because he felt no fear when it came to Tanya. Somewhere in his heart, he still had love for her. Meanwhile, Antoinette wrote Jeremy's name in that book, in which all the sin eaters are recorded. Now every spirit lurking in that mansion had begun tormenting Jeremy, and even Antoinette could hear his screams echoing through the halls. From her expression, it was clear that there would still be many more sin eaters to come inside that mansion. If you enjoyed the video, remember to give it a like and subscribe to the channel.